Um, I'm here to talk about the Profiling Academy or profiling guidelines. And this talk is actually about best practices that we from FHIR in the Netherlands have gathered while doing a lot of profiling. And we documented that somewhere. And this presentation is about that actually. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Marten Smits. I'm from the Netherlands and I work for a company called FHIR. Um, and I have a background in medical informatics. So I studied medical informatics at the University of Amsterdam. And after that, I started working as a FHIR consultant at FHIR, or FHIR as it was called before. And I'm a profiler. So what I do is I create FHIR specifications for. Now I'm doing that for the Dutch government, but I've done some for Norwegian government, some for companies that wanted to implement FHIR and wanted to have FHIR specifications especially for them or for their use case. So they hired me or someone from FHIR to actually do that and help them implement FHIR. And I'm also a software engineer, so I also work on some FHIR tools at FHIR, and I switch that around, so it's about 50% of my time. In this session, we have actually have two I saw on the program, and the second one is for Q&A and for people who actually want to bring their own use case and want to discuss that with everyone here, so we can go and actually talk about what's best for their use case, because profiling is not you should do this and this and this and that's it, but it's actually really dependent on your use case, what you want to do, what you want to constrain, and how far you want to constrain it. And first, I want to talk about the Profiling Academy in this session. I want to give a demo about what it is, what we do, and afterwards, I'm going to talk about some of the best practices that we actually documented and going through some of them. So what is the Profiling Academy? Actually, the Profiling Academy started when Ewout and I actually wanted to got a new coworker and wanted to actually learn him how to do profile authoring. So we documented a lot of our initial best practices in our internal wiki and said, well, here's a lot, here's videos, here's text, here's presentations about what we did. These are real life examples about what we did and how we solved some of our problems. And afterwards, after a couple of months of doing that, we actually thought, well, maybe this could be helpful for, well, people outside of our company. So we actually published it on Simplifier in an implementation guide, and it's called the Profiling Academy, and it's right there, and that link. And who is that for? It's actually for people who want to start or are already profiling FHIR, and beginners and experts both. And it's most of the time it's tutorials, guidelines, frequently asked questions we get, best practices that we, there you go, don't have to hold this anymore, best practices we came up with, and also it has some tutorials and exercises. It's actually it's split up in different modules. So there's a module called, for example, Introduction to FHIR and Profiling for people who are actually starting that and don't want to go through all of the specification within the FHIR spec about profiling because it's gathered everywhere or split up, and it's actually a real hassle to find everything and all the tiny lines of profiling everywhere. So we try to make that into a summary and put that into a module. There's one about extensions. There's one about the FHIR mapping language, for example, which is really advanced, but there's some for everyone. And we're still working on adding new modules. So the blue ones are actually already there. We're still working on that as well. It's been, well, it's evolving and evolving. And the ones that are in black are still on our list to do, but we will publish them and release them, and we will tweet about that and email you about that and bother you about that once we've done that. And besides all these modules, we also have feature movies. So there's actually a couple of my colleagues. I didn't get to go yet, but I will shortly go probably, who recorded videos about how to actually set up a Simplifier project, for example. And it will have all these screen shares about how you do that. There's a section of helpful links where you go to the FHIR specification, to the Zulip chat, all that stuff. And there's actually one about our company and how to get in contact with us. And if you have any issues with the Profiling Academy, how to raise an issue or how you want to add your own best practices, for example, that would be really great if you do that. Because we don't want to keep that all for us. I mean, now it's just our best practices, but it would be really grateful if you, with all your experience that you will have or you already have on profiling, you will get that here as well, so we can create one big website or guidelines of how to do best practices in FHIR. So that's everything I wanted to say about Profiling Academy, so what it is, where it is, and the rest of the presentation I will go through some of the best practices that we gathered. And I will do that by the hand of one of the modules that we wrote. I will do that actually in 3 parts. So planning, collaboration, and delivering your profiles. First part is the planning. So what you want to do when you want to start with profiling, you want to check what's already out there. So you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to reuse national profiles. You want to find a profiling strategy about how close or how badly you want to constrain all the resources. You want to think about naming conventions of your profiles. And you want to see how to get people back to your functional definition, because obviously you don't start with FHIR, you have some of logical models or whatever, or functional definition actually, which you have implemented, and how to capture that inside of your profiles. So start with what's already out there. What do you want to do when you want to start profiling? If you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of stuff has already been done. A lot of stuff is still going on. People are implementing stuff. People are profiling stuff. And that's all gathered across a couple of websites. So first you want to do is you want to look at the FHIR specification. There's some core profiles there already. So it's not only just the FHIR core resources, but for example, there's a core profile called vital signs, which is globally profiling how to use observations to capture vital signs. And it's really great, actually. We reused that in the Netherlands to capture our vital signs, so we didn't have to profile that all for ourselves. You want to take a look at Simplifier, because there's a lot of projects going on, people working on profiles throughout all of the world, and there's a lot of things you can reuse there. Not only to copy one-on-one, for example, but also to see what kind of decisions people made during their profiling and how close they constrained resources. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. You want to take a look at the FHIR registry. And all of these links are here inside of the picture, so you can actually go look at that when I publish these slides. And you also want to take a look at the FHIR IG registry, because especially for the US, that's where the US core stuff lives. And that will be really helpful for you guys if you actually want to create a profile. Go look at what US core, for example, Brad already did, and take a look at that and start constraining that, for example. So when I say reuse profiles, is also what I mean is you can derive from it. So this is actually a picture that to explain this is what we did, for example, and what US Core did, Argonaut people did, is we have a global FHIR core patient, and we in the Netherlands constrained that, and you guys in the US here constrained that to a US patient and a Dutch patient, and this is where you capture all the US specific stuff or the Dutch specific stuff. For example, we added a national identifier there. We have one. We're very happy about that. And we actually... Yep, there we go. We have one. So this is actually our social security number, for example, and all of the hospitals actually capture that. So this is what you can... There's a lot of issues with that, but that's something else. But we actually specified how to put that into a patient resource. So which identifier you use, which identifier system you use for that, and we put that into our national patient. For example, you guys had an extension called race. We're not allowed to do that, so that lives in your US realm. And now, for example, our hospitals, this is one which is called LUMC. It's a medical center, an academic medical center. They're starting profiling right now, so they want to expose their data to the public. And what they want to do with that is they want to also expose their hospital patient number next to the national identifier. So what they can do is they can just derive from the Dutch core patient. They have all these constraints that we made in the Dutch core, and they can just add a single constraint, for example, to specify how they expose their hospital patient number. So they don't have to capture, again, the national identifier or whichever other constraints we did on the national level, but only have to apply their own constraints on how they differ from us. Yeah, sure.
So you also then have a foreign patient?
Yeah, I have to repeat the question for the recording. So do we also have a foreign patient? We don't, but the national identifier is optional in our country, so in our profile. So we only constrain that if you have a national identifier, this is how you capture it. So foreign patients will not have that, and they will probably have or a temporary ID that you get when you just got into the country and start working here, or you don't have a national patient identifier and it's missing. So, but that's some of the, actually, I'm going to talk about that in a while, some of the things that we thought about when we actually are profiling this. Please just ask questions during the slides, that's okay. Don't wait for the end, because I would like to make this a little bit interactive if you, I was like that. So this is what our Dutch patient looks like. Here is our national identifier, it's called PSN. And this is how we constrain that. So there still is, you can see that here. There's still here 0 to star, 0 to multiple identifiers, and you have one optional patient identifiers, and we created that with a fixed value of what's it called, I think, well, BSN probably somewhere, some naming system that we put in, and we would like to have you provide a value with that. We also added data type, actually, so human name, we constrained that to capture our weird voorvoegsels, which is a family name prefix. And so we can actually capture the van, for example, for Eddie Van Halen, which is a Dutch name, to separate that from the family name as a whole, because we structure our family names in such a way that we alphabetic sort on Halen instead of on Van. So we want to capture that structurally in our EMRs to be separate from the whole family name. And this is actually something that everyone in the Netherlands can reuse. So we created one NL Core human name data type, and everyone creating profiles in the Netherlands can now say, oh, for human names, we just put in the NL Core human name and all the constraints that these guys made in the extensions, and we can reuse that. One thing that we actually thought about really hard when constraining the Dutch patients or the other core profiles was, how far are we going? So do we only capture the things that do we constrain everything? allow only the stuff that we can think about, or do we just specify the optionality and say, if you use this, do that, and all the elements that we don't touch are grayed out? For example, here in allergy intolerance, this is an open model. So let me see here. Clinical status, we only constrain clinical status and verification status here. Put a binding on code, and added a. Oh, this is actually yours, Brad. So this is what you did. You only constrained the patient here to be US core. Used clinical status and verification status and added binding on that. Added binding on code. And left the rest of the resource out of the open for everyone to do what they like. So if everyone wants to implement this US core patient, this allergy intolerance, I mean, you can just take that, use these constraints, and constrain on top of that. So all the elements that Brad here didn't touch, or the Argonaut people didn't touch, you can still constrain that and use that as FHIR core as a whole, left that to you. The other one is a really close model, the one right to that, and they said, we actually close down everything that we don't need. So this is a consent resource that only captures status, category, patient, and period. And all the other stuff, they said, well, don't ever do that. Don't use these elements, but the pros and cons for that are these. You can do that. You can constrain everything and say, all the elements that we didn't specify, you're not allowed to send. This makes it actually really easy to validate resources. So you can't put any garbage in the other elements because, for example, a validator would scream and say, hey, you're not allowed to use this element in our use case. And it would be, you get much more implementer feedback actually, because when you actually don't specify an element, left it out, you leave it out, and people are not allowed to use it, and they will come to you. They will get like, why can't I put my data in this element? I want to, and then you can make a new version and tweak it, so you'll get a lot of implementer feedback if you do that. The cons about it is that you get more versions of your model. So you will have to iterate really fast. It's only backwards compatible. New elements require a new version, which is bad. And the way for open modeling is actually really good is that you only specify things that are used in the national level and focus on everything that must be supported. For example, you can fit more data in. People can actually derive from your profile, so they're way more reusable. And it's more of a thing that I would say once you get a more specific use case, for example, system-to-system interactions inside of one hospital, you want to close everything down. You don't want to get any garbage in your resources, and you want to say, we only use this and this and this element inside of in this interaction. We send really specific messages to one another. We are the only ones who are actually using this profile, and then you can really specify how that message or FHIR resource would look like. But if you are profiling on a national level and you want everyone to reuse that and look at that and only constrain national stuff, like, for example, the things that we saw at a race extension, more put people in the right direction on how to use human name, for example. You want to keep a more open model, and everything in between is, well, you have to think about this stuff.
So your national profile is mostly open, and then the optional one is mostly closed, or what's
Yeah, so our national profiles are just like what you did in US Core, are mostly open. We only constrained, we made all of the things are optional. Most of the things we said MustSupport, and just like what you did, if you have the data, put it in. If you don't, it's optional. We bound it to specific value sets. For example, we don't have RX norm, but we have something national. So for our medication stuff, we We say, well, you have to use our G standard, it's called, and it's mostly open. But when we see people deriving from that, which is actually happening, you see it getting more close and close and close and close and close, until you have these system-to-system interactions where you can't reuse it anymore. But there isn't any use case to reuse it. So, and that's probably what will happen to most people. But still, there's also people who are only implementing our Dutch patient for system-to-system interaction, and you will see a lot of optionality there, and people who have a hard trouble validating their messages, because everything is still possible. A lot of stuff is still possible, and the validation won't work as well as it will with closer models where you have more and more and more constraints and only one single message would be correct. So we also thought about naming conventions for a canonical URL. So each of the FHIR conformance resources have a canonical URI, which is like their globally unique identifier for their definition. So for example, the NL core patient has FHIR.nl/FHIR/structure definition/NL core patient. And we have some of our detailed clinical models. This is one for dispense, which is for NICTIS, which is our standardization organization, national one, which is called NICTIS. So it has NICTIS.nl/FHIR/structure definition/zip, which stands for the detailed clinical model, called dispense, and it has version 2 right now. And we have actually documented this. So when, for example, I'm off the project and someone takes over, people say, well, these guys really thought about this. When we're creating newer structure definitions, we are still able to reuse that strategy. You will see an example for Germany who did a little bit of the same thing, only they started with their resource name. So they can actually sort it alphabetically on resource type, which is really nice, actually. I would thought about that, but it still is actually a little bit, because now for us it's sorted on our project names and then on the resource type, which is also pretty nice. I mean, it's mostly about consistency, which I think everyone here will like, and about not having to think about it in the future.
So this was actually my question this morning, and I was wondering which way to go.
Yeah.
So if you could do it all over, which way would you go?
Still the first one, I think. Yeah.
By project?
By project, yeah. We actually talked about it on Zulip when we started to think about this 2 years ago in the Netherlands, and I think a lot of people agreed with what we did. I mean, the US core guys do the same thing. They have US-core-patient. I think everyone can have another convention, but that's why we wanted to capture these actually best practices to able to standardize this, because we can't put this in the FHIR spec. So I think it's good if people have other best practices for this, that they get back to us and say, hey, we have a better way to do this. Maybe you should do this as well, or document this option, so other people can think about that as well. And next one is always try to capture functional definitions. So we have a lot of detailed clinical models where they're already there nationally. We use them for V3, we have them for FHIR, so we can actually capture the same information inside of V3 as we will for FHIR. And we want to link back to that. So inside of the structure definitions or the value sets, we want to get that linked to their functional definition somewhere documented on a wiki, or that's where it lives. And you can do that in multiple ways. We use the concept resource to actually map value sets in FHIR to the functional definition of that value set somewhere on a wiki. We use structure map to, well, we don't use it yet, but we're starting to use it to get relationships of entire structures into detailed clinical models, which are structured a little bit differently. So you can actually have automatic conversion, for example, between V3 and FHIR, which would be the dream, but I don't really believe in that. Don't tell anyone. This is, I hope not a lot of people in the Netherlands will watch this, but I think this is a little bit of a hassle, but it can be done theoretically, and it uses the FHIR mapping language. So I think there's a talk tomorrow about the FHIR mapping language in structure map, and for example, Graham uses that to do automatic conversion between DSTU2 resources and STU3 resources, as far as that is actually possible, and he will talk about that tomorrow. But what we use most of the time is actually we capture the mappings of each element that we constrain inside of a structure definition using the mapping element or the mapping component to our functional definition. So what we get here, this is actually a Norwegian example, which we did. It's rendered really pretty in Simplifier, actually. So this is a project that we did for Norway. And there was a lot of elements out from different systems that we wanted to capture in one structure definition from 3 different systems called Orbit, DIPS, and Orplan, and some of the national ones, which was an organization called Helsevest. And we captured all these definitions inside of the resource. So you would have 4 tabs with behandelingsnummer, which is procedure number, actually, and the patient ID. And you can capture where all these functional definitions would go into the FHIR resource. So Orbit, DIPS, and Orplan would actually have good documentation on where the elements of their database would go into the FHIR resource. So they would have a lot of less hassle of actually implementing this or finding out where to put their database elements inside of the resource because we already captured that for them inside of the structure definition itself. And it would look like, well, there's the XML for that. You see procedure.basedon has a mapping for behandelingsnummer in Helsevest here. And it would have a general.treatment identifier.treatment number for Orbit. So both of these systems would actually know what to capture inside of that FHIR element. Next part is about collaboration, and this will sound, this is not really FHIR specific, actually. But this is just about things that we ran into when we worked together on the Dutch profiles. And we really hassled with that, actually. So we did that for NICTIS, which is our SDO. And we started out with actually working on Dropbox. I would say to anyone, as I said when we actually started that, don't ever do that. It was terrible, especially when people were, well, contributing at the same time. It would, like, so it would break all the time. So I introduced them to something magically called Git, and they didn't know what it was. So that was a bit of a shock to me, but we started using Git, and it was actually, people actually got on it quickly, and it has, as many of you might know, great version control. So we actually work on a Git repository right now. This is our source of truth. And you can also obviously use Subversion if you like, but don't use anything like Dropbox or SharePoint or whatever to do this stuff. capture it in a proper version control management system. And I believe Git would be the best option, as many of you would. But think about it. That's the main thing I can give to you about this. And we stored everything in a Simplifier project, so other people could reuse it, actually. We thought about using the FHIR IG publisher, but once we looked at that, it was still immature and it would break all the time, so we started up with Simplifier. And that actually gives you a really nice representation of your work when you're actually working on it. So you can view it all the time and not have to stare at XML all the time, but you can look at your stuff rendered nicely. You can work with multiple people on it. It would link examples to structure definitions and all of that stuff. And it would log all your changes. And actually, we created a Git webhook to Simplifier. So every commit we did to Git got straight into Simplifier, and it would render it really nicely. So Git stayed our source of truth, and everyone in the entire world can actually look at our results on Simplifier. Also think about your workflow and feedback loop. So when you actually want to, so I have 5 minutes, I see. So when you actually want to have feedback from everyone, your EHRs, your experts, we actually have a lot of statuses here mentioned. So they're mapped to FHIR statuses. And once everything is on pending, we will inform our feedback. Our experts actually take a look at this. You have 6 weeks for feedback. We will gather all the feedback, put everything to final, for example, and then move on, move on, move on. Also, do a lot of issue tracking. You can use Jira, whatever issue tracking system you like. You can use Trello, but please have an open issue tracking system for everyone. So everyone using your project, looking at your profiles can actually, or know where to put issues. You can do it on Simplifier as well, and it will stay really close to all your resources. Write an implementation guide. Profiles itself are not enough. They have to actually have manual text where people know how to interpret your profiles. Include at least a section about data definitions where you render all your profiles. Include a section about use cases. If you have any, US core or NL core would not have any specific use cases, but write something about audience and what it's used for. Write anything about actors. What would clients and service need to do to implement this? Which interactions do you support? Do you support search? Which search parameters do you support? And add a lot of examples, because people love examples, especially developers would love to have examples. They would look at examples first and then look at your data definitions, probably. This is an example of an implementation guide we did in our Simplifier IG editor, and you will see the same sections that I just mentioned. We'll have packages, profiles, extensions, value sets, examples, and something about use cases. This one is a wiki page we did for the Dutch government. It will have the same sections, and US Core has the same section as well, which is created with the IG publisher. It will have guidance, profiles, extensions, like all the data definitions, all the value sets, all the search parameters, a capability statement about what a client and a server are supposed to implement, a section about security, obviously, and then there's a section about delivering, which is, the first one is always fill the narrative with something. So not a lot of people are actually exchanging structure definitions with each other, but if you do, please fill it with something narratively, and it could be just like extension of patient with
race code, for example. Just add something to your narrative. It could be a single line, but it would always be good to do that. Capture the definition. Inside of the first, also capture the description of your structure definition, which we found really helpful, actually, of your structure definition inside of the first root element dot definition. This way it gets rendered, actually, in the dictionary rendering you see here. It will also have the same thing as Graham's rendering will have. It will actually render a description on the root element of that definition, so everyone looking at it knows exactly what it's about. Think about how you want to code which data type you want to use to code your for coded extensions. So there's a difference between the code, a codable concept, and the coding, and it all has its benefits. But please think about that when you're actually doing that. There's a whole section on Simplifier. Yeah, I can explain it to you, but I only have 2 minutes on the Profiling Academy, and we can talk about it later if you like, about when to use which. But for example, codable concept is a lot more broader, and you can capture more inside of it, where coding is more limited, but you can validate it better. There's all pros and cons to each, but it's something you have to think about and be consistent in when profiling. Think about future use of your data. Also capture fields on how to search your profiles. For example, consent can be used to describe a lot of different concepts. It could be described as a treatment directive or an advanced directive, and also constrain, for example, in this case, the category element of consent to a fixed value, so everyone can query on that category to retrieve both, for example, only the treatment directives of your profiles, which isn't a requirement in your functional model, but it will be when you use it in FHIR. Add descriptions to your extensions, not only in the extension definition itself, but also in the profiles that you use it in, because most of the people will not click through to the actual extension definition, but they can look at the profile, see, oh, this is an extension for, well, the family prefix, for example. This is what it's used for. I don't have to click on it to actually see what it is. It's just really practical for your readers to capture it also in the extension element of your profile. Let's see. Always write purpose of your extension, not only for your implementers to know why you actually extended a patient or a structure definition, but also for yourself. When you actually go to a new version of FHIR, you know which extensions you can throw away, for example. So you still know why you extended a patient with this element, and maybe in R4, this element would be included in the core specification, so you can actually strip that out and go to, you have an extension less. So some of the time we actually got into that. We left an extension which was already captured in the core, and then, well, we slammed ourselves in the head, but it's what we now do, actually, is we document especially why we created extensions, so when we migrate to a newer version, we know which one to stripe. Reuse extensions, well, this is obvious. Check if the FHIR core already has extensions, check Simplifier, reuse those. Put your constraints, most of the time put it in a profile and constrain your extensions as less as possible so everyone can reuse them inside of their use case. MustSupport, be very clear about what you mean with MustSupport. And we always put it in the profile itself, so not in the extension. So you don't say, well, support value of this extension. Of course, you want to support that when you use it, but we also put it into the profile, like you must support these extensions or not. The IsModifier, we actually put it in the extension level. So when creating an extension, we put an IsModifier tag in there. So we don't put it in the profile level. It's most of the time because of when you create an extension that actually modifies your resource. So it modifies the meaning of the resource you're putting it in. It will always do that. It will do it in which use case you will ever put that extension. So put it right in the root of the extension definitions instead of in every profile that you reuse it in. Yeah, I think we're in time. Well, the mapping things that I explained earlier, please take a look at that. It has a lot of great feedback we actually got from that we actually captured these mappings to all our detailed clinical models. And this is, I can summarize it, but please visit our Profiling Academy. Add your feedback. Please, Brad, I invite you to take a look at that. It would be probably great value if you take a look at that, and maybe we can add it with some of your best practices as well. And thank you for your attention. We have the next session is actually for questions and bring your own use case. So if you still have questions or want to discuss use cases or best practices, please stay here. I'm here, well, the entire day still, and we'll be here tomorrow. And in the next 40 minutes, we'll be actually discussing this stuff. Well, thank you for attending, and if you stay, please do.